The Pope's doctrinal watchdog will clear the way for same-sex blessings by nuking scripture and tradition. Joining us with the latest from the Eternal City, Church Mill and Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, Archbishop Víctor Fernandez, the man Pope Francis picked to head the DDF starting in September, seems hell-bent on approving blessings for same-sex couples, something the same dicastery in 2021 reaffirmed was impossible. Back then it said, quote, God can't bless sin. What's Fernandez telling the Italian newspaper? A lot involved with that interview. He's talking about normalizing, allowing maybe perhaps priests to be married, and also this whole thing about same-sex blessings, which we want to focus on for a minute. Normalizing the blessings of same-sex couples, Jules, seems a really heavy lift for Fernandez. Not only the DDF, his own DDF said you can't do it categorically back in 2021, but the Catechism of the Catholic Church also is a huge roadblock. Paragraph 2357, for instance, teaches, quote, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. So the question to you, Jules, is how is Fernandez going to get around the Catechism standing in the way of blessing homosexual couples?
Well, simple. He's calling for a rewrite of the Catechism. He's basically said that the term objectively disordered, that's the translation of the Italian, by the way, or at least his version of the Catechism in the Italian. He says that this term, objectively disordered, is problematic, and this is a problem of theological language, he says. Because it so deeply hurts people who are, homosexuals or who are living in homosexual relationships, and theological language should not be so offensive. He goes on to say that Pope Francis would undoubtedly use a different kind of language. And we know that Pope Francis did use a different kind of language. He got rid of the death penalty in the Catechism, and he basically reversed centuries of biblical and magisterial teaching. And our friend Fernandez is suggesting that he can do the same thing with the Catechism's clear teaching on homosexuality, which, by the way, is also profoundly pastoral.
Now, before going on for a second here, I'd like your thoughts, Jules, on this point. Shouldn't a shepherd of the church be more worried about a soul suffering in hell for all eternity, far more than being concerned about maybe possibly temporarily hurting someone's feelings by confronting them with the truth that could actually save their soul? Your thoughts?
I used to have this phrase, wherever Paul went, wherever the Apostle Paul went, there were riots. This is, by the way, what an Anglican bishop once said. Wherever I go, people serve tea. The job of a shepherd is not to have people serving him tea, but it is sometimes to stir up riots, because he's speaking the truth and people do not like. Our sin nature simply does not want to confront the truth. And then the job of a shepherd is to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Our shepherds today want to only comfort people who are disturbed, but they don't want to disturb people who are living in sin and who are too comfortable in their sin.
Yeah, I mean, even Jesus with the woman at the well said, you've had 5, 6 husbands already, and none of them were your husbands, and even the one you're with now is not your husband. So he was pretty direct with all that. But the Catechism, the same 2357, that paragraph, also teaches that homosexuality is based on Scripture, quote, on Scripture, sacred Scripture, which presents homosexual acts as grave depravity, end quote. So what's Fernandez going to do about sacred Scripture that clearly stands in the way of blessing gay unions?
I wrote an article on this, as a biblical scholar myself, and having studied and taught this topic extensively, and explained to my students how the liberals are constantly trying to twist hermeneutics interpretation so that they can get around the fact that Scripture clearly prohibits homosexuality. However, in the last 20 years, there have been biblical scholars who are themselves homosexual, gays and lesbians, and they have come out and said there is no way we can engage in exegetical gymnastics to prove that Scripture does not condemn homosexuality. They basically said, let's be honest, let's put the clear teaching of the Bible aside on this topic and admit we can't get around it. We just ignore the Bible here. But what Fernandez is doing, he's engaging in quite a dishonest hermeneutical strategy, exegetical strategy, which is quite unnerving given the fact that he's now head of the Pontifical Biblical Association. And he's saying, well, these texts need to be read in their historical context and understood. And he says things like, ridiculous arguments like, oh, if we take the text literally, then we will also have to obey St. Paul on women covering their heads and force everyone who comes to church to all women who come to church to cover their heads. But these sorts of arguments have been debunked a long time ago. They are arguments school children would use.
Yeah, a woman covering her head is far different than two homosexuals living together and the church actually blessing that as if it was a wonderful thing. Who is Fernandez drawing on, Jules, when he talks about blowing up Scripture here, about this radical private interpretation of Scripture?
Fernandez has revealed in the last few days that he's profoundly, deeply influenced by one of the greatest hermeneutical philosophers of the 20th century, an agnostic German Protestant by the name of Hans-Georg Gadamer. Now, I know the works of Gadamer pretty well, and obviously this is not the place to go into that. But the good thing about Gadamer was that he, got rid of the Enlightenment rationalism and empiricism, the clinical way of interpreting Scripture. But the more problematic thing is that he says we all come to Scripture with our own prejudices and our own preconceptions, which is, of course, correct, with our own tradition, which is, again, correct. But then he says, in this dialogue with Scripture, we bringing our own tradition, our meaning, and Scripture putting up its own meaning, there can be a new meaning emerging. And this, he says, can lead to, I quote, an inexhaustible multiplicity of answers. And if this is this is the person who has influenced Fernandez, we can understand why he can simply keep these texts on homosexuality from the Bible aside, or keep so many other texts and say, well, we'll just interpret it differently according to the context.
Well, that's a private interpretation of Scripture that would really make even Martin Luther blush. It's so subjective. Now, Fernandez also is championing an unfettered dialogue, without any Catholic guardrails whatsoever with heterodox theologians. How does such dialogue, can you expand on that and how such dialogue could ever reach an objective conclusion unless it was safeguarded somehow by Catholic truth?
Well, basically what he's doing is he's following Pope Francis's lead, which Francis gave to him. Francis's commission to him in the letter, and the conclusion of what both of them are doing is getting rid of the whole raison d'être, the reason for existence of the congregation of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. They're doing two things. First of all, they are saying once upon a time this was known as the Holy Inquisition, and it used torture and execution to persecute dissenters. We are ashamed of that. We need to get rid of that. We need to have a new image of this office. But then they go on to say, and they are hinting at Ratzinger, when he was the head of the CDF, very clearly implying that it was Ratzinger. The CDF came after so many theologians like Schillebeeckx and Hans Kuhn, etc., and that was terrible because it stifled their creative thinking. And now we need to create a new climate. Incidentally, he says under Cardinal Luis Ladaria, his immediate predecessor, this sort of persecution of theologians did not take place. And he's going to take it one step forward and create an atmosphere where there is freedom of expression and thought and freedom to say what you want to as a theologian, which in a sense means that you don't need the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith any longer.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, if you get a whole bunch of people together, and some of them mathematicians are saying 2 + 2 is 3, some of them are saying it's 5, some are sticking with the fact that it's 4, and all of us are right, nobody's wrong, and we all can get along and talk and have it all out. At the end of the day, how do you ever come to a conclusion on objective truth unless you represent what Christ gave us 2,000 years ago? It doesn't make sense to me. But all of us, anyway, have sinful tendencies to break one or more of the 10 commandments on a regular basis. It's called fallen human nature. And all of us sinners need to be guided by Christ's truth to obtain heaven and avoid hell. So woe to those shepherds who won't give Christ's saving guidance to his sheep. Jules, thank you very much for your report and your analysis.
Thank you, Brad.